University of Minnesota Twin Cities respectfully acknowledges that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Dakota people. The University of Minnesota is founded as a land-grant institution, and we recognize that our founding came at a dire cost to the Dakota people. The Dakota were forced to cede their lands in return for goods and services, but the government did not uphold the terms of those treaties, leading to widespread devastation. We recognize this painful past, and we honor Dakota people's history on this land, their sovereignty, and their continued contributions to our region. Minnesota comes from the Dakota name for this region, Minnesota Makoche, the land where the waters reflect the skies. The Dakota and numerous other indigenous peoples whose cultural, spiritual, and economic practices are intrinsically woven to this landscape hold this land sacred. We recognize them as original stewards of the land and all the relatives within it who had thriving and vibrant communities prior to disruption by settlers. Today, the state of Minnesota shares geography with 11 tribal nations. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm tribal sovereignty and hold the University of Minnesota accountable to recognize and counter the historical and contemporary injustices that continue to impact Indigenous people through mutually beneficial partnerships, research, policies, and practices that respect indigeneity. Hello, my name is Ann Waltner, and I'm the chair of the history department, and I'm very pleased to invite you to the May session of the history department book club. The Eastside Freedom Library has in the past co-sponsored sessions, and they are a co-sponsor tonight. Perhaps before we go on, I should explain a glitch. I can't actually explain it. Virtually everyone who has not changed their name is signed in as Clayton Jelinek. This gives me an opportunity to introduce Clayton. Clayton is my partner in this project. In fact, the book club was Clayton's idea. Clayton is a development officer. We do not know why all of you are named Clayton Jelinek. If it bothers you, you can go to the participant list and change your name. Many of us have been on Zoom constantly for the last year and a half, and this is the first time this error has ever crept up. That is the story of why everyone is named Clayton Jelinek. So today, the book that we will be discussing is by Ben Wiggins. The title of the book is Calculating Race. Ben is not a history PhD, but he is a historian, and we're expansive. He got his degree from the University of Minnesota in American Studies in 2013, and he is currently working at the University of Minnesota. His position in the library. He is the program director for a program that's acronym is DASH. It's the Digital Arts, Science, and Humanities program. He has graduate status in history, and he's an affiliate member of the history department. So we very much regard Ben as being one of our own. And when I saw in a CV or something that his book was out, I said, would you like to present at the history department book club? And he said, yes. And then he said, and I want Kaylee Horan to be in conversation with me. And so I said, terrific. And Kaylee has a book that's on the brink of coming out, which is called Insurance Era: Risk, Governance, and the Privatization of Security in Post-War America. And so what we decided to do is to have this event be Kaylee discussing Ben's work with Ben. And then in February or March, we're going to turn them around. And I don't know, maybe you'll all be named Clayton Jelinek or Kaylee Horn or Ben Wiggins in February or March, and Ben will be Kaylee's interlocutor. And Kaylee got her PhD in the history department here in 2011, and she's currently an associate professor at MIT. So I think what we'll do now is turn the floor over to Ben, who I think will talk very briefly about the book, and then he and Kaylee will engage in conversation. As they're engaging in conversation, if you have questions, put them in the chat, and in the last 20 minutes or so, Ben will answer the questions, and maybe you'll have some questions that Kaylee will also want to respond to. This is a project that has now been going on for almost a year, and it's been just a delightful project to get to know what colleagues are doing, and to hear people talk about their book. So Ben, it's all yours.
At the moment that you said I'm going to turn it over to Ben, my dog came in, and that's just the timing of Zoom. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Anne, for inviting me to do this. Thank you, Clayton, for organizing. Thank you, Kaylee. I couldn't think of anyone else I'd rather have here, so asking me these questions. So I'll just give a little very brief overview of the book. Calculating Race essentially investigates the historical relationship between risk assessment and race, with a particular focus on how they intertwine over the last 150 years. The concept of risk and the concept of race are both relatively modern and have become some of the strongest organizing forces in human society across the last 4 centuries. The German social theorist Ulrich Beck and the British social theorist Anthony Giddens have compellingly made a case that we live in a risk society, and that the assessment and management of risk is increasingly coming to dominate social interaction, from interpersonal to economic to the geopolitical. The American sociologists Michael Omi and Howard Winott have likewise convincingly made an argument that race, through what they call a process of racial formation, has come to be one of the 2 or 3 dominant forces in classifying populations, especially in Europe and the Americas. And what both these arguments foreground is that the concept of risk and the concept of race have a history, they're socially constructed, and they are consistently being defined and redefined through social interactions, large and small. So in my book, I ground these theoretical understandings of risk and race by recounting how the variable of race has historically factored into the statistical analysis of risk. As you might expect, the evaluation of racial data in risk assessment begins in the insurance industry. But my analysis kind of follows this assessment of racial data beyond the insurance industry, into the criminal justice system, into social welfare programs, and into other measures of social economic status and well-being, and into lending and elsewhere. And so racial disparities in wealth, incarceration, home ownership, and other measures of social and economic status and well-being are undeniable at this point, but we really haven't fully grasped all the structures that undergirded this gap between whites and populations who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. So in my research, I've found that the construction of these BIPOC populations as disproportionately risky is a part of that story. From the 1880s forward, industry and government utilized race as an actuarial shortcut to the assessment of risk. In that process, risk assessment techniques essentially used historical racial data to find differential risks in BIPOC populations, such as the comparatively short lifespan of African Americans, while ignoring the histories of oppression that produce these conditions and cause such differentials in such as the structural violence of African Americans consistently endured through slavery, the Black Codes, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, and the like. So I'll turn it over to Kaylee for a discussion.
Thanks, Ben. I guess I'll start by saying that I really enjoyed this book. It covers a somewhat esoteric topic, but it does so in this very accessible way. So it's slim, it's easy to read, and it offers both an introduction and a deep dive into the key people, events, and institutions that shape the way Americans have quantified and calculated race. But I should say that this book also, it fills a major gap in the risk literature by focusing very specifically on the relationship between risk and race in US history. So this topic has been covered, for those of you who aren't in the field, the topic has been covered by many authors, but it's usually in field-specific studies that are focused on insurance or on medicine or on policing or housing policy. And then the general studies of risk tend to sometimes address race maybe in a single chapter, or simply treat the relationship between risk and race as inevitable and natural. And Ben's book is different, and I think it's really great, and it's a huge achievement. So thank you for writing it, Ben. I think it's a real contribution to the field. So I want to start with a question about audience. There's a lot of cross-referencing in the growing but still small literature on the history of risk in the US. And that leads to a lot of citing one or two books or articles when it comes time to discuss race. So all of us in this field know, for example, that actuarial science helped define race and racial inequality in the US. We know that policing and race have a long and entangled relationship. And we know that the FHA gave birth to redlining. But how exactly did all of this happen? Ben, I think you explained these developments so clearly and so well. And so when I was reading, I often stopped and I thought, yes, that's exactly what I wanted to know about X, about the history of this or that process, system, or institution. So I'm curious if historians were the primary audience for this book when you were writing it, and if you thought of historians as the primary audience, or if there were other audiences you had in mind, perhaps in sociology or other fields that don't often draw on the historical examples that you offer.
Thanks, Kaylee. Yeah, I think when I started writing this, I guess there wasn't an audience in mind in some ways, because you start with the thing that kind of, for me, it was the FHA. It was the thing that kind of just, I like many historical projects, it gnawed at me. And it was something that I really wanted to explore further. So, I think I wanted to figure it out for myself. And eventually I came around to embracing, an audience that was historians, but also towards the completion of the book, I had begun to talk to a lot of people who are dealing with race and risk assessment right now. And those are some of the people those are the people that motivated me to really extend it all the way forward to at least discuss towards the end of the book, the present day. And so those are also been, no knock on this crowd, those have also been some of the most rewarding conversations that I've had since it's come out, because those are people in the field who have direct influence, and that's been something that's been really huge to develop for me.
Thanks, Ben. So you already mentioned housing and the FHA as something that you were really compelled to research. I'm curious, how did you settle on insurance, criminology, and housing as your primary fields of analysis for this book? I personally found this trilogy pretty satisfying, and I appreciated the chronological and thematic focus, which basically takes readers from the earliest efforts to underwrite human cargo as a part of the slave trade, all the way up to discriminatory algorithms in the present. But I wonder if you considered other fields when you were writing, and if you perhaps had endless time and resources, where you could dig into other fields that involve the confluence of race and risk. What might those fields be?
Sure. Yeah. Well, like I said, I kind of started with the FHA and specifically with the FHA underwriting manual. And this was brought to my attention by the work of a pair of historical sociologists, Melvin Oliver and Thomas Shapiro. And basically, they argue that the FHA's efforts in a lot of ways contributed to the wealth disparities between Black and white populations in the United States. but they didn't really concentrate on it. And it was just this really intriguing document. And so when I finally found it I found a couple of versions, and I might mention later the ultimate one that I found. I saw that it was a really well worked out system of actuarial risk rating, and I was intrigued to figure out how this, like, it wasn't something that just developed. The FHA was this emergency relief organization, and it didn't develop in the 4 or 5 months where the document had to be written. So I traced it backwards and found criminology and insurance and broader structures of lending, really making up the constellation of this core part of the history of risk and race in the United States. I'd say for the limitations or the places where I didn't get to explore, healthcare was the largest one, and I think there was a point at which I just I needed to get this out in the world, let's say, and I just couldn't. I think I would estimate that if I had done a single healthcare chapter, it felt like it would have taken like 5 more years. So it's just the navigating the insurance archives that have material that I was looking at that was 140 years plus old, and the resistance and pushback from corporate archives was so strong that going into a medical history of the latter half of the 20th century, which is when healthcare really develops a lot of its practices or it's a lot of its modern character or contemporary character in the United States. It wasn't something that I felt I had the time and resources to do. So I hope that that's kind of work that other people pick up. And I guess that I would say that the way I have gone since this project ended is I have gone backwards in time. So now I'm exploring that other end, which is strangely almost easier to explore, but it's of further back in time. We don't always think of that as easier to explore, but slavery and insurance. And I'm working with a couple of collaborators, one from NYU and one from Chicago, and looking at places like Lloyd's of London and then the various state-run or state-sponsored insurance companies in Europe who were insuring vessels in the slave trade.
That sounds amazing. I'm excited to see what you come up with for that. But the sources you do look at, Ben, are so fantastic. And I think there's just so much rich and unique archival material in this book. And I really particularly appreciated the images that you included of archival material in the book, because they give readers a real sense of the materiality of the paperwork that's actually behind these very abstract processes that you just discuss and historicize. So I don't know, I think you might have some sources to share, which you may or may not want to, but I guess my question is there a source or a set of sources that you found like particularly compelling during your research? Were there sources you looked at, you didn't get to include them? And I mean, I guess finally, which historical sources in your story do you think deserve further attention from scholars of risk, and perhaps from students or the general public, general population? Sources, talk to me about your sources.
Sure. Yeah, and Clayton might be able to display a few of these here, but yeah, there's just so much paperwork. Kaylee, you know this from researching the similar topic, and I think insurance in particular, finding all of this documentation on insurance is what actually inspired me to kind of pursue the project that I just talked about, because you realize that there's all of these copies and all of these accounts all over the place. So even as going into corporate archives has tripped me up in some ways, it's the fact that there are policy documents that are retained by the policy holders, or accounts or people writing to brokers and things like that, that makes the newer project seem feasible if needing to come at it from kind of an oblique angle. So so yeah, there's so much documentation of this stuff, and I'd say that the most compelling documents I found were probably in Wyoming. And that was a surprise to me. I just saw a little bit of a reaction there in your little screen. Yeah, I would have never expected it. The American West does not play an outsized role in this history, but I guess I looked for so long to find the first edition of the Federal Housing Underwriting Manual, could not find it anywhere. NARA doesn't have it. The New York Public Library had what I kind of thought was the first edition just by process of elimination. But I found out that that wasn't eventually, because eventually I went to Wyoming. A Chicago History Museum archivist told me that Frederick Babcock, who I wasn't even sure if he wrote the thing. I think a lot of people think that it's Homer Hoyt who wrote the thing, but I thought that for a while. But essentially, Frederick Babcock, this guy who was self-proclaimed first real estate actuary, and someone who had an academic role and a role at insurance companies, and eventually became the author of the FHA underwriting manual. His papers were at the American Heritage Center in Wyoming. I got to go there, and they gave me a little grant to spend some time out there, and basically got to go through all of the papers. In the very first box, I was able to see in the very first box, I was able to see the underwriting manual there. It wasn't in the finding aid or anything. And so my big hit was like day one, box one. But then I finally, I spent the time going through like all 36 boxes. And I relay this story because there were so many more things in there that confirmed, this is the very last place I went, and it confirmed kind of how I had thought the history was unfolding. And it was a full circle moment for me, where I actually figured out that Babcock was hired from Prudential, where he was developing, I can't say this with certainty, but he was probably doing what was along the lines of redlining, or just at least investing the money that came from the premiums, which you have, as an insurance company, you have to put someplace for your eventual payouts. And then basically he developed the FHA's scheme for investing in real estate. And so it was a real full circle moment. But also, I think going through all those things, I just saw that he was a really kind of boring person, and all of this stuff was as boring as I thought it was going to be. And yet there is the structure of systemic racism. You see it in these things that look like really mundane documents. And I think it was an important exercise to go through it all, and to I don't know, some days I wish I was an art historian looking at like pretty things or whatever, but I look mostly at these forms and these like that. And there's very few people who find them interesting, but I do, because I can just see in there these structures of power, I guess. And they're really they don't really emit that, but if you look close enough, you see it all over.
Well, Ben, I've long thought that explaining why things that are seemingly boring are actually interesting is a really nice job. So I'm wondering if you could maybe, do you want to explain one of these documents that were just on the screen, or share them, say something about one of those sources?
Sure.
With the audience?
Yeah, let's Clayton, do you want to get that back up? Sure. Yeah, that's the underwriting manual that was just kind of unlabeled. I think one of the interesting things about this is it was always meant to be edited. And as you, if you've read the chapter on the housing risk assessment stuff, we have to remember these are dynamic systems. And so even in this first edition, it's not a bound book. It's a book that has that has kind of like a 3-ring binder system. And I should have probably shown the second or the full, it's displayed out. But I think in there you can see in the way it's bound that this system is supposed to feed back into itself, and it really does. And these they would care, the people who were assessing the house or valuing the house would carry these, and they would get updates, and all of their data would go to the research team, which would then make edits to the formula, and then you insert new pages into this. So that's one I can give a little bit of background on. Yeah. This is Julius Caesar Chappelle's draft for the first anti-discrimination legislation, and then the other one is the adult rate table for quote unquote colored risks from John Hancock. And that's one of those places that it was a corporate archive. It wasn't, I didn't get the most access there, but in the end, those are some of the people that really took the message of this book to heart. And I've been working with them really ever since, even before the book came out, to kind of see what we can do to address this history. And they seem extraordinarily committed to changing how they do insurance in the present day, because they didn't really have an understanding of this stuff.
Yeah, they're really remarkable documents, Ben. I might shift gears a little and ask you a few questions about content specifically, and rather than just sources. I want to talk a little bit about insurance and this theme that runs throughout your book, the social construction of both race and also risk. So you make it very clear in chapter 1 that insurers who grappled with race at the end of the 19th century understood the category to be socially constructed, at least to some extent. So you quote the Weekly Underwriter, which is, for those who aren't familiar with insurance history, it's like a big trade journal for the industry. You quote the Weekly Underwriter in 1884, noting, quote, "In time, the American Negroes will become as healthy as whites, but it is not so now." That quote really stood out to me. And there are similar instances throughout the book where experts who wield actuarial data note its limitations, right? And so these moments of recognition have always fascinated me in my own research. They suggest a belief on the part of risk analysts in the objectivity of statistics and their ability to accurately describe the world as it exists in the present. But they also, these moments of recognition also suggest a kind of flexibility regarding statistical truth. So I get the sense that these historical figures knew that there were limits to what statistics could offer, what they could describe about the world, but they remained committed to actuarialism as a kind of faith. And so I'm curious if you could talk about that and maybe tell us why you think that was the case.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you want, it's these moments of recognition that provide a tension for historians, where you don't want to be presentist and judge the people on the moralities and understandings and cultures we have right now, and yet you can see that this was already a moral issue for them, that they were recognizing that there were social forces that were discriminatory, and yet they chose to ignore them, or they chose to assign different, they chose to further dehumanize and racialize these people, and kind of it was between, in varying turns, willful ignorance and outright kind of race science, and things like that. So I would say that in those moments of recognition, there is, you do want to hold some accountability, or kind of hold them accountable in their own time, and kind of historicize that too. I think it's very powerful that W.E.B. Du Bois, when Frederick Hoffman at the Prudential was writing this justification for discriminating racially, Du Bois was already contextualizing everything. And in his, if the industry had listened to Du Bois, they would have understood the historical context that led up to this, instead of the idea that it was natural inferiority or something like that. Obviously, that's wishful thinking now, but that's something I think even in their own time they understood that this was a moral issue. I'd say that I like to think about these issues. One of the concepts that I've been working with recently is out of Thomas Piketty's new book on inequality, capital, and ideology, and he uses this term inequality regimes. And I think it's not the idea that every society is unequal and they're unequal in different ways. That's not really a revolutionary idea, but he uses this language of comfort, that we're comfortable with discriminating in some ways and not comfortable with discriminating in other ways. And I think that really that framing really helps us to assess how each use of risk assessment is comfortable using some social data and uncomfortable using other social data. And this goes all the way up to the present, and varies by class of insurance. But we can think about, if it's not race, is it gender, is it disability or ability, and things like that, and what are we comfortable with. And it helps us to reflect on how these societies were comfortable or not with varying levels of inequality, and I think gives us some sense of how do we reflect on our own contemporary moment too.
Yeah, I mean, what you described sometimes seems like a political process, particularly in the material and insurance. And I know from my own work, that workers in insurance, leaders of the insurance industry, they've for a very long time claimed to act in a kind of apolitical fashion, right? So we might say the statistics, we might wish the statistics were different, they say, but they are what they are, and the world is what it is, and it's not our job to change it, right? This is the what they say constantly. But as you note, political considerations pop up constantly in insurance practice. And for that matter, in risk calculations involving criminology and housing and other kinds of public systems. So I think it would be great if you could talk a bit about the political nature of risk, and how objectivity as a concept fits into that relation. So is objectivity, which is something that a lot of folks who work with risk claim on a fairly regular basis, is objectivity a cover for politically motivated decision making? Is it something else? How does objectivity fit into this story?
Objectivity gives us a veneer, I think, that allows allows the justifications to really be kind of vocalized. But at the same time, I think what you mentioned in that question was that I find it more important is it's not my problem. I can recognize it, but is it a problem for capital? Is it a problem for governance? Is it a problem? If it's governments, they're assessing it as we can only do so much to regulate these businesses, or if it's businesses, they can think about we can only do so much to um, address historical inequalities that were caused by governments in the past or even in the present. And so I think there's a real kind of just passing around of the blame, and the individual industries feel like they don't have responsibility for the whole thing. And I think this is something we're seeing corporations really struggle with in the present moment. They're getting finally social pressure to reform in a very meaningful way, and they want to reform only to the point that it doesn't cost them money. And I think there's a kind of inverse in government where it's want to reform only to the point where it doesn't cost them the next election, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of reform, I wanted to ask you a question about proxies. You know, there are definitely, there's a shift in chapter 4 in your book where you kind of turn towards a more recent past and discuss the numerous proxies for race that show up in risk classification and a variety of different fields. And so in that chapter, you note, that race is not a category of enlightened reason, but a technology of power. And yet you emphasize that the efficacy of the concept of race depends on it being perceived as a natural category. So you shed light on this process, I think, really well in the book, this process through which race comes to seem as natural and rational and real. But it seems to me that proxies for race have played a huge role in this process of naturalizing race, almost ironically, over the past 60 to 70 years. Let's talk about proxies and what you call the entanglement of race with other categories of difference. So first, can you explain what you mean by proxies in that chapter 4? And then perhaps, can you tell us a bit more about the historical contexts that led risk makers and managers to turn to proxies rather than using overt racial categorizations in fields like insurance or housing? And how does the proliferation of proxies change the way we understand race or risk historically?
So proxies are they don't necessarily have anything to do with race. Proxies are just kind of a term for a big catch-all for kind of one variable approximating another. And I like to think of these in two ways. So there's, or at least in terms of risk assessment, there's from the 60s onward, basically very little use of kind of bad actors using intentional proxies, where they use one classification to proxy for another thing that's protected in some way by law or maybe just by social norms. And so that's usually a conscious effort on the person of assessing their risk. Then there's this unintentional proxy, which is just that entanglement. And if you don't look for proxies, you can get them, you can find them. I think the most common one that people are familiar with is zip code as a proxy for race. But it's happens not because people are intentionally, sometimes they are intentionally, but usually not because they're intentionally using zip code as a proxy for race. But we're a deeply segregated country still, and where you live matters quite a bit. So, and I think this is even kind of an outdated example. And what's happening now, because zip code's too big, and it also was never, it's usually census tracts, but that's an aside. And so that would be proxy for. So what I think is a more contemporary problem is we don't know what the data is, or we don't know what our models are doing. We don't know how, we don't even know the kind of shape of the data that we're collecting. We're collecting so much data. And this isn't just a recent phenomenon. I mean, it's made all the, more prominent by how much we live our lives on computing technologies. But we have so much data now that if we don't take out our, or if we don't test for proxying in our calculations, we will continue leading it on, or continue leading it into feeding it into the models. And we will also eventually, if we have algorithms learn from themselves and they don't tell us how they're learning from themselves, we won't even know if we're proxying, because increasingly we don't understand how algorithms are learning from themselves, which is why we have to make algorithms that are what computer scientists call explainable, where they actually explain themselves, or they kind of have an output that tells us what they're doing. Because if you just use intelligent machines, you won't understand how they're learning from themselves. So this is a really pernicious problem, and one that's not, we can technically solve it, but we need a much stronger will. There are many very smart computer scientists who are testing for disparate impact, but we haven't really installed that consistently.
Thanks, Ben. So interesting. I'm looking at the time. I've got a lot of questions I want to ask you. How much time do we have, Clayton? Do I have time for one more?
Oh, yes. Go for it.
Two more?
Sure. And others are welcome to send them in the chat. So far, we haven't gotten any that I'm seeing. So I would say keep on going with your questions, and we'll ask others as they start coming in.
All right. Well, jumping off of the proxy, your excellent answer to my proxy question. You mentioned zip code and redlining in your response. And I'm wondering if you could talk briefly about debates between historians and among historians on the origins of redlining, which is something you talk about quite a bit. So redlining the process through which residents of particular neighborhoods or regions are denied access to loans, insurance, or other financial services. How does your book enter into the conversation that's actually quite new? There wasn't a lot written about redlining until about 10 or 15 years ago. So what does that conversation look like? How are you entering into it? And why does the history of redlining and its origins matter?
Sure. Well, I'd say racialized housing discrimination in the 20th century is really multifaceted. It's this combination of these private and public policies. It's restrictive covenants, it's blockbusting and steering, and many other segregationist aspects of law, zoning, things like that. Also this like violence and intimidation, all these things. But I think the traditional understanding of redlining has really been influenced strongly by the actual maps that contain the red lines on them. And so the Homeowners Loan Corporation was this emergency relief, Great Depression era New Deal organization that predates the FHA by I think a year or so. But they gave money directly to consumers, and they expended their funds really quickly. But one of the things they did kind of as they were winding down their really brief program for direct lending was help do a bunch of research for just housing policy during the Great Depression. And they built these security maps. They labeled some areas hazardous and a grade D, and then they put red as the color to grade these areas. And so what I think, even though someone like Kenneth Jackson, who was writing in the 80s, kind of made the claim the Hulk wasn't the one that did it. The FHA, I think he said the FHA exhorted racial discrimination as public policy. And so we've known this for a while, but this narrative of Hulk being the one and the red line security maps being the real force in housing discrimination, it's been hard to shake. And I think scholars like Jennifer Light, Amy Hillier, yes, your colleague Jennifer Light, and then Chloe Thurston have provided really important correctives to this and shown how deeply the FHA is implicated in actually with a much more sustained duration of this program and basically barring any African American or person of color or even some ethnic minorities from getting at this really important mutual mortgage insurance program that freed up all the credit for the people looking to buy single family housing in the Great Depression. And so there's a whole almost generation from 34 to 48 and kind of even beyond probably who didn't get access to the credit in this or how getting access to mortgages in this era, and that's just had a legacy that's been so lasting.
We do now have a question from the audience. It's from Earl Ross. To what extent did social Darwinism influence the constructions of risk race? Do you address that in your book? Your topic has me thinking about Muhammad's condemnation of Blackness. He discusses the connection of data as formation for creating racialized policies. Are you familiar with his scholarship, and how does this research connect to your scholarship? Did you look at how Black insurance companies of the early 20th century and Black banks addressed risks? Were there differences?
I can try to tackle at least some of those things. So yeah, social Darwinism, I do address that in the book, mostly along the lines of Hoffman, Friedrich Hoffman, who was he started as a actuary or statistician at the Prudential and then became eventually the vice president of the company. But Friedrich Hoffman was more or less hired to, I think, wage kind of a PR campaign in favor of restricting regulation on the insurance companies, anti-discrimination regulation. And he made this into a social Darwinist argument. He also made this into an argument around just government intervention generally, and that if the government intervened to what he thought was prop up inferior races, then they would not only cause the downfall of insurance companies or the insurance industry generally, but also more or less, perhaps cause the downfall of like the white race and America and all of these things. It was very catastrophic. So I think the early tenor of the conversations in risk and race around formal risk assessment, integrating race into its assessment, don't have this social Darwinist inflection, but very quickly once regulation starts to happen or is threatened by governments, then it turns that way. As far as the statistics for data formation for racialized policies, I would say that that's a really complicated question that has to be kind of taken in its own times, and I think I want to address that by kind of advocating for the way out of this, kind of thinking about the way to a less discriminatory or non-discriminatory future is probably only through the continued collection of racial data and through showing disparate impact and really demonstrating. I mean, this has become a sort of logic that is highly persuasive. And so I think rather than talk about the early history of that, because there's so much, I would say that we're kind of in a bit of a bind where we have to continue to think about things in the terms of the concepts of race as we work to dismantle them in some ways. And then Black insurance companies and Black banks address risk. Yeah, these were very important. I didn't concentrate on them. I kind of wish I had written more about them. But there's already some great work that's out there on Black insurance companies, especially. And I think the tragic thing about Black insurance companies is because of the segregated nature. There is no statistical denying that that the mortality rates were different. They still are between races, and so it may, when you limit your population to just Black clientele, it does make your pool of risks riskier in an objective way. And I think that in some ways limited the potential for Black insurance companies because they didn't have the entire human race to insure as like the other companies did, and the other companies were ensuring healthier populations or risk pools, and so they made more profit and sustained longer and things like that.
I might just jump in on that really quickly, if that's okay. Just to add a little bit to what Ben was saying, Black insurance companies, actually, because of what Ben was talking about, ended up being kind of pioneers in public health in a lot of ways, and did a lot of outreach to their customers and their clients, trying to kind of distribute information about healthful practices and ways to combat disease. And so they became very interested in that question for precisely the reasons that Ben is describing. There's great work out there on it.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and that would be a question from David Wiggins. How do you think these lessons and how data perpetuated racism in your areas of research apply to the way that the public school system has kept social Darwinism alive in education?
Well, full disclosure, this is my uncle. Thanks, David. I think this is, I guess I don't know if I can quite answer. The public education system is not something I research, so I don't know if I can quite answer this well. But I would say that in addition to healthcare, that's kind of another area where I think you see these massive disparities in opportunity, and you want to. I think there still needs to be a lot of research on how these broader structures of systemic racism can influence interpersonal relationships and practices and broader or other systems like the systems that actually operate within education. And so I think that there just needs to be more work done on that. I don't know exactly how we're thinking about social Darwinism in the contemporary education system, but I think that there's certainly connections between achievement or intelligence tests and things like that, or just ranking and rating and trying to quantify. These are broader constructions of quantification, broader structures of quantification. And so I think within there, you see influence of these systems that I've been talking about in the book, where race is made really race insidiously pervasive in these systems of quantification, and so it's hard to separate these out.
Yes, we're just about out of time. So I would like to thank everyone for coming. I would like to thank Ben for writing the book and Kaylee for engaging with Ben's book. If you would like to hear part 2 of a conversation between these two wonderful people. We will be staging another conversation with Ben talking about Kaylee's book in February or March. Clayton will be sending around a message, an email message in a day or so. If you are so moved to contribute to the history department, you may do that. We'll also provide a link where you could contribute to undergraduate research assistants in DASH, right? In the okay, so yes, support the undergraduate research assistants in the DASH program, and Clayton Jelinek, the real one, not one of you, not one of you many imposters, has put the link in the in the chat, and will be in the email. And I do thank all of you for coming. And I see names of past graduate students. I think Clayton and I have discussed this, and when we go back to face, we are going to keep this virtual, because we really like the way it brings, you know, a community of generations of graduate students back together to talk about the wonderful work that you're all doing. So thank you very much. And I hope to see you next. The June book is by Catherine French, and I don't actually have the title in front of me. It's called something like Good Households and Household Goods. And it's about domestic life in the wake of the Black Death. She's a historian of the Middle Ages. Household Goods and Good Households in Late Medieval London. So that is the title of the book. And then the July book, the meeting will actually have to be at noon, because the speaker is in South Africa. It's Coney Benson, who's written a book, done an illustrated book about housing choices in South Africa. And she and her illustrator will be in conversation with the process of making of basically doing graphic history. And so I think that will be at either noon or 11 o'clock in the morning, because of the time difference. So we're actually scheduled all the way through March with a book a month. It's an amazing group of scholars. So thank you all very much.